ago, one of my missionary friends, Larry Niemeyer, who's been working in East Africa for more than a decade, told me the story of the first new convert that he had in his church planting ministry in Kenya. He said that this man grew in the Lord, was discipled, and very shortly he placed him in a position of leadership in this new budding church. To his dismay, he discovered that this man was well known in the community as a thief, and that even after he became a convert, he continued some of his undisciplined thieving activities. One of the dangers that we face as we work with people that we do not know well in cross-cultural context is we try to find those people that will be the best leaders for a growing new church. And in doing that, we oftentimes don't have adequate information or understand how to proceed. Larry also tells the story of working in a matrilineal setting and bringing people to know the Lord there and finding some very fine young men who were nurtured in the Lord and became very committed believers and had great potential for leadership in these churches. But over the years, as he watched them, he discovered that they had very little influence in their community. He didn't know exactly what the problem was until he began to study their matrilineal relationships. What he discovered was that as husbands in the communities of their wives, that they were peripheral people and had no influence. So while they were very devoted and committed believers and responded very well to the discipling ministry of the missionary, they were really incapable of exerting significant leadership in that community because they were social outsiders. In looking at the nature of community and looking at the political relationships that exist within community, we have to understand that Christian leadership is much more than just being a willing and able disciple of the Lord Jesus Christ. It also involves having an appropriate place in a community. Tonight in our class, we're going to look at the issue of political community. We're going to look at how leaders are chosen to fit within a community. We're going to see how that position that they have within the community is crucial to their effectiveness in leadership. It's also important to understand that Paul found this very crucial in terms of his directions to Timothy in relationship to training and equipping Christian leaders. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, some of the characteristics expected are to be above reproach, to be self-controlled, respectable, and hospitable. Those things all have to do with one's reputation in the community. Another thing that he asks is that they be able to manage their own family well. We need to understand the nature of family. Extended families are very common in some parts of the world, and matrilineal families are quite different from patrilineal families. A leader must know the family and be able to manage the family well. The leader must also have a good reputation with outsiders. As Paul reflects upon this situation, he recognizes the fact that political community is a very important part of leadership. And the criteria for leaders have to do with as much with their relationships within the community as it has to do with their relationship in Christ and their relationship with other believers. Good evening then. Tonight our lecture is Lecture 9 in your syllabus on page 29, the selection of a leader. This evening we're going to be doing a case study from 1 Samuel chapter 9 and 10. And before I begin the case study, I'd like to talk for just a minute about the importance of case studies in our study of leadership. One of the projects that you have on your assignment, if you're doing the research project, and you all are, is to produce some case studies, at least one case study. A case study is a narrative. It's basically a description of something that happens. Tonight we're going to use a biblical narrative, a case study in the Scriptures, and we're going to examine that narrative in depth. We're going to analyze the narrative. We're going to see what are the details there. To help you understand your research, one of the things that you need to do as part of your research is to develop a narrative of a particular case. A narrative is just telling a story, getting the details of the story so that you have details that you can analyze. The better the detail, the better your analysis. The weaker the detail, the weaker your analysis. So as you think about your own research projects, my first lecture this evening is a lecture to show you some basic methodology. I'm not going to show you how to develop a narrative because I'm just taking an existing one out of a biblical text. But as we analyze this narrative, you'll see how once you have a narrative to go ahead and do the analysis. So as you begin your research projects and you think about the things that you need to do, one of the things you want to do is to try to develop some narratives. In asking the question, what kind of narratives, you may want to begin with a narrative about the way a person became a leader. That's a very useful kind of narrative. That's the kind that we're going to look at tonight. You may also want to look at some narratives that deal with conflict. We'll look at a conflict narrative next week. And there are many kinds of narratives, but usually those are good ones. How a leader became a leader, and how people engaged in a situation of conflict, what happened. And you just describe all the details, every step. It's kind of a little history of what happened in this process. These are the kind of case studies that are very, very helpful in terms of understanding leadership. Once you have the narrative, then you go back through and you begin to analyze it with some of the key questions that we'll be discussing here in the lectures. In the syllabus, you will have the chapter that I have written that kind of sums up the questions for you. It comes out of the leadership workshop I did in Brazil back in '85. And in that particular chapter, the kind of things that I'll be lecturing about are summarized for you. We'll give you some guidelines in terms of following up on that material. Tonight I'm going to look at 1 Samuel 9. I'm going to read the narrative to you, and then we'll come back and do the analysis. As I read the narrative, you can refresh your mind in terms of the story. You can think about the things that will be part of what is part of a narrative, and then we'll come back and we'll do the analysis. 1 Samuel chapter 9. There was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah of Benjamin. He had a son named Saul, an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others. Now the donkeys belonging to Saul's father Kish were lost. And Kish said to his son Saul, "Take one of the servants with you and go and look for the donkeys." So he passed through the hill country of Ephraim and through the area around Shalisha, but they did not find them. They went on into the district of Shalem, but the donkeys were not there. Then he passed through the territory of Benjamin, but they did not find them. When they reached the district of Zuph, Saul said to the servant who was with him, "Come, let's go back, or my father will stop thinking about the donkeys and start worrying about us." But the servant replied, "Look, in this town there is a man of God. He is highly respected, and everything he says comes true. Let's go there now. Perhaps he will tell us what way to take." Saul said to his servant, "If we go, what can we give the man? The food in our sacks is gone. We have no gift to take to the man of God. What do we have?" The servant answered him again. "Look," he said, "I have a quarter of a shekel of silver. I will give it to the man of God so that he will tell us what way to take." Formerly in Israel, if a man went to inquire of God, he would say, "Come, let us go to the seer," because the prophet of today used to be called a seer. "Good," Saul said to his servant, "Come, let's go." So they set out for the town where the man of God was. As they were going up the hill to the town, they met some girls coming out to draw water, and they asked them, "Is the seer here?" "He is," they answered. "He's ahead of you. Hurry now. He's just come to our town today, for the people have a sacrifice at the high place. As soon as you enter the town, you will find him before he goes up to the high place to eat. The people will not begin eating until he comes, because he must bless the sacrifice. Afterward, those who are invited will eat. Go up now. You should find him at about this time." They went up to the town, and as they were entering it, there was Samuel, coming toward them on his way to the high place. Now the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed this to Samuel. "About this time tomorrow I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him leader over my people Israel. He will deliver my people from the hand of the Philistines. I have looked upon my people, for their cry has reached me." When Samuel caught sight of Saul, the Lord said to him, "This is the man I spoke to you about. He will govern my people." Saul approached Samuel in the gateway and asked, "Would you please tell me where the seer's house is?" "I am the seer," Samuel replied. "Go up ahead of me to the high place. For today you are to eat with me, and in the morning I will let you go and will tell you all that is in your heart. As for the donkeys you lost 3 days ago, do not worry about them. They have been found. And to whom is all the desire of Israel turned, if not to you and all your father's family?" Saul answered, But am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel, and is not my clan the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such a thing to me?" Then Samuel brought Saul and his servant into the hall and seated them at the head of those who were invited, about 30 in number. Samuel said to the cook, "Bring me the piece of meat I gave you, the one I told you to lay aside." So the cook took up the leg with what was on it and set it in front of Saul. Samuel said, "Here is what has been kept for you. Eat, because it was set aside for you for this occasion. From the time I said, 'I have invited guests,'" and Saul dined with Samuel that day. After they came down from the high place to the town, Samuel talked with Saul on the roof of his house. They rose about daybreak, and Samuel called to Saul on the roof, "Get ready, and I will send you on your way." When Saul got ready, he and Samuel went outside together. As they were going down to the edge of the town, Samuel said to Saul, "Tell the servant to go on ahead of us." And the servant did so. "But you stay here a while, so that I may give you a message from God." Then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him, saying, "Has not the Lord anointed you leader over his inheritance? When you leave me today, you will meet 2 men near Rachel's tomb, at Zelzah on the border of Benjamin. They will say to you, 'The donkeys you set out to look for have been found.' And now your father has stopped thinking about them and is worried about you. He's asking, 'What shall I do about my son?' Then you will go on from there until you reach the great tree of Tabor. 3 men going up to God at Bethel will meet you there. One will be carrying 3 young goats, another 3 loaves of bread, and another a skin of wine. They will greet you and offer you 2 loaves of bread, which you will accept from them. After that you will go to Gibeah of God, where there is a Philistine outpost. As you approach the town, you will meet a procession of prophets coming down from the high place, with lyres, tambourines, flutes, and harps being played before them, and they will be prophesying. The Spirit of the Lord will come upon you in power, and you will prophesy with them, and you will be changed into a different person. Once these signs are fulfilled, do whatever your hands find to do, for God is with you. Go down ahead of me to Gilgal. I will surely come down to you to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, but you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what to do." All right, this is a narrative. And you see it has in it details, conversation, description of events. It's a history over time. Narratives need all of these things. If you don't get the gist, the essence of conversations, you have nothing to analyze. If you don't get details about the people, you have nothing to analyze. The narrative is full of detail. Now, ordinarily when we read the scriptures, we skip over all of that detail. And so tonight what we're going to do is we're going to go back and we're going to examine some of that detail. We're going to find out what that detail means, and we're going then to see what the applications are in terms of the question of how do we go about selecting a leader. The first question that we're going to consider tonight is Roman numeral 1 in your syllabus. What are the qualities sought in a king? What are the qualities sought in a king? The narrative is about the anointing of a king. And the details that are here are given to us by the Spirit of God to help us understand what went into the process of God's selection of a king through his servant and through his prophet Samuel. As we look at the beginning verses in the text opens with the statement, there was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish. Doesn't start with Saul at all, does it? Doesn't begin with Saul. It begins with his father. Now that's something that is so alien to us in our culture. In America, when we think about a leader, we don't go back and ask who the father was and what was the father's reputation in the community. We generally look at that person, we look at their qualifications, we examine their education, we look at their performance, and we say, hey, this person must be the right person or this person must be the wrong person. I am sure that when they considered employing me here at Biola University, nobody ever thought to ask about the character and quality of my father. It's probably a very important question, one that we should ask much more often than we do. But you see, because we emphasize the individual and the performance of the individual, we neglect to see where that individual fits in the social structure and what are some of the criteria that may be important about the relationships of that individual in the social structure. Here, the first statement, the very first statement, is about Kish. And it tells us that he was a man of standing. And that's important. Obviously, or the Holy Spirit wouldn't have put it there. He was a man that was recognized, a man of importance, and not only a man of importance, a man of respect. In other words, he was someone recognized by the people of Israel as one who was an honorable person, a man of standing. The second thing you see, it's actually not the second, it's really the first, it's the second thing that I want to look at, is that he was a Benjamite. Now again, we pass right over that. What's the importance? We really don't know. It's not something that we consider in terms of our own understanding, but it was so important that it was the very first phrase placed in this text. There was a Benjamite, a man of standing whose name was Kish. A Benjamite means a particular tribe in Israel. So that must have been an important fact. Not only does he talk about the tribe, but he talks about the particular lineage in this tribe. Kish is the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah of Benjamin. In other words, the particular lineage that Kish came from is delineated for us to know and to understand. Now, of course, this was written to Jewish people. They would understand that much more than we would. But the critical thing is that they needed to know that it was a very important part of their process and their understanding as this text opens and begins to describe what happened and what follows. The third thing we see is Saul. He had a son named Saul. And then we get a little introduction into who Saul was. It tells us what? He was impressive, right? And how old was he? Doesn't really give you his age. It tells you that he was young. Okay, now, again, you read that in terms of your own culture. When you hear young, what does that usually communicate to you in terms of age? Teenager, okay? All right, that is not what it means in Hebrew world. Okay? What it means in Hebrew world is that if he is a man, he's married. If he's not married, he's not a man. Now that's really not part of our culture. As our culture, we define man as somebody who gets to a point where they are physically developed and where they've stopped growing and where they can play football. That's one of the key issues that we have in the definition of man. But usually in most cultures of the world, a person is not a man until they actually have children. So that in talking about Saul as an impressive young man, in all likelihood he was married and he had children. He would not have been a teenager. In fact, if you read the story of David, was David called a man? No, he was called a boy. Okay, very important to see that. And when David went to fight Goliath, he was called a boy. The text does not use the word man for him. He was not a man. He was a boy in terms of the cultural conceptualizations of things. So as we see here, he had a son named Saul, an impressive young man. That gives you some insight into Saul's age, into his maturity. He obviously wasn't a senior man. He was a young man. But he was definitely a man. He had maturity. He had recognition in the community as having reached a level of responsibility. Okay. As we go on in the story now, we get into the narrative. There are some donkeys. And his father is concerned about these donkeys. And so he asks his son to go out and to find them. And as you look at him going after those donkeys, you find that Saul looks and he looks. And finally, in verse 5, they've been gone for so long that Saul reaches the conclusion that his father now will be worrying more about him than he'll be worrying about the donkeys, and they probably had better turn around and go back. Now, there are two very important things that we can see in this. Number one, Saul obeys his father. He's a married man. He has children. And his father sends him on an errand, and he does it. He goes off to do the work that his father tells him to do. Find these donkeys for me. Now, they were part of what we would probably call a corporate family group, an extended family. The senior man, Kish, was the one who was the head of the family, the one who had the responsibility for all the economic life of the family. But Saul, at this point, was old enough that he was capable of running his own show, but still in subordinate relationship to his father. The scriptures tell us he's obedient. Okay? Obedient in this context. The second thing that we see is that he really understands his father and respects him, because at the choice of when he's gone long enough, he understands his father's concerns. He knows that his father will have greater pain if the son is lost than if the donkeys are lost. And so he reaches the conclusion that we should turn around and we should go home. This shows a man of sensitivity. Oftentimes when we read the scriptures and we think about Saul, we only think about him in the latter part of his life. And we don't see all the fine qualities that were there that caused God to anoint him to be king over Israel. We see only his failures. But he didn't begin as a failure. He began as a man chosen by God, anointed by God because of the fine qualities that he had in reference to the task that God had before him. The last thing that we find in relationship to the qualities that Saul had is that he knew the custom of the people of Israel. He respected the custom, and he worked with that custom to accomplish his objectives. If you look in verses 6 to 10, you see that the servant invites Saul to go see the man of God. And Saul right away says, we don't have anything to give him. You know, if you're going to go see the man of God, you need a gift. That's custom. You know what the expectations are. And then the servant says, I have a quarter of shekel of silver, and Saul says, okay, let's go do it. And so they're off to see the man of God. Not only did he respect custom, but Saul was ready to seek God and to get direction from God in this matter of his father's need. He was willing to do that. When his servant suggested it, the only thing that slowed him up was the fact that he didn't have an appropriate gift. And so as we look at Saul in the beginning of his career, you see him willing and receptive to take God's direction and take God's advice. You find him respectful and obedient to his father. You find him a man without equal physically, but also one who has respect in the community because he's old enough. He's a man at this point to have that respect. It's interesting, in just 3 verses, really, we see a tremendous amount of information here, details, key facts about these people. And I think that you need to understand that as you do research and begin to build case studies, that the details about people, where they fit in the social structure, can be so crucial to understanding them and their abilities or their inability to do leadership. In the prayer time, I talked about the fact that in matrilineal societies, leaders chosen by a missionary were not able effectively to lead. And the reason was they didn't have a position in the social structure which allowed them to do that. So this whole idea of the position in the social structure is a very important idea. All right, let's go on. Roman numeral 2, what are the social structural regulations? To answer this question, we need to drop further down in the text. You remember as we were reading the text, we got to verse 19 to 21. And in this particular place, Samuel said to Saul, in verse 20, and to whom is all the desire of Israel turned, if not to you and all your father's family? Now this was a radical statement. Saul understood this right away. The desire of all Israel turned to my family? And then Saul makes a comment. He says, but am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel? And is not my clan the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such a thing to me? Now, those facts are given to us because they're crucial in terms of understanding this case study. They tell us exactly where Saul and his father fit in the social structure of Israel. To understand the social structure of Israel, we need to reflect for a little bit on the history and background of the people of Israel. If you remember, just a little ways back, In Judges chapter 21, the tribe of Benjamin was attacked by all the other tribes of Israel and nearly eliminated, decimated. And the reason for it was they had such terrible young men in it who raped and murdered the wife of a man from the tribe of Ephraim, that the other tribes came up against them. The tribe of Benjamin was not willing to bring these men to justice, and so the rest of Israel came, surrounded them, and basically conquered them. So there were just a few hundred men left. It was really decimated by that particular conflict. And so Benjamin was a tribe of notoriously bad people at that particular time. Those that survived had difficulty getting wives. They had to work out a particular subterfuge to get wives for them. You go back and look at that. And so this was not an honorable group of people in terms of the totality of the nation. And when Saul says, I'm from the tribe of Benjamin, the smallest in all of Israel, and I'm from the smallest family, the weakest family in the tribe, this makes a statement about his relative political power, his relative influence. He says, I'm a very influential, I'm a very small man. How could you say that the desire of Israel is turned to me? Now, to understand the significance of this choice and why God did this, it's also important to review a little bit of the history. You remember the story when Jacob wanted to get a wife, he had a little bit of a problem. What was the problem? Okay, he had to work. Okay, what else? He was cheated. Okay, how was he cheated?
He from the other lady, from the other girl's sister.
Okay, instead of getting the woman he wanted, he was only given the older sister. He was given the older sister. I should not say only given the older sister, okay? All right, at that point, what happened?
He cried foul.
He cried foul, that's right. And how did his father-in-law respond?
He gave him the other sister, but made him agree to work 7 more years.
Okay, he gave him the other sister, but made him agree to work 7 more years. Now, how do you think that got Jacob's marriage off to a start? What kind of a start? Conflict, that's right. Definite conflict. There was conflict between Jacob and Laban, but also, what do you think happened with the 2 women? In fact, what do we know happened with the 2 women?
Competition and jealousy.
Competition and jealousy, that's right, Andy. Competition and jealousy characterize their relationship. If you read through the book of Genesis, you'll find that that competition and jealousy was pervasive in the family life of Jacob. Rachel was terribly unhappy. Why was she unhappy?
She couldn't have children.
She couldn't have children. Leah was terribly unhappy. Why was she unhappy?
Because she couldn't get Jacob to love her.
Okay, she couldn't get Jacob to love her, and finally, Rachel wouldn't even let Jacob sleep with her. And so she didn't have a husband. She didn't have normal marriage relationship because of the jealousy and the rivalry between the 2. And if you remember the story when Leah's son Reuben was out and discovered mandrakes and brought them back, Rachel then relented to allow Leah to have a relationship with Jacob again so that she could have those mandrakes, which were a fertility drug in their eyes, and she'd hoped that that would help her to become fertile and pregnant. Of course, God opened Rachel's womb. She had Joseph and she had Benjamin, and Leah had many sons. And they had a rivalry with each other in terms of their handmaidens, remember? Rachel gave her handmaiden first, and Leah said, well, if you can do that, I can do that. And so they competed with one another in terms of for their husband's love and for the achievement of having the most children. You need to, again, understand their culture to know that having children was just a critical part of a marriage. And a woman who didn't have children was deemed a failure. And you remember the fight between Rachel and Jacob over this whole issue. Jacob said, did I close your womb? It's not me that didn't let you have children, it's God who did that. And so there was this big argument between them. Well, the argument between Leah and Rachel continues on and on and on. Okay? The argument between Rachel and Leah ended up in what happened to Joseph. He was sold. Sold where? Egypt, okay? And what happened to Benjamin in all that process?
He was kept
Spoiled, yeah.
His father kept him and he took care of him, but Joseph wasn't going to let him get away with that. Remember how he used Benjamin to get even with his brothers? So you see, the rivalry between Joseph and his brothers was very strong. Benjamin also was a part of that rivalry with his brothers. Now, which tribes in Israel are the tribes of Joseph?
Ephraim and Manasseh.
That's right, Ephraim and Manasseh. And which tribes in Israel are the tribes of Leah? Or what's the biggie?
Judah.
Judah.
all the rest.
Okay, that's right, and all the rest of them. Okay. Now, of course, there's Rachel's handmaiden and Leah's handmaiden, and they're allies as well. But the key rivalry emerged between Ephraim and between Judah. They emerged as the basic competitors, the ones who had the most power. And if you know the story of the division of the kingdom of Israel, how did it divide? The tribe of Judah and what other one?
Israel.
Ephraim. Ephraim was the key tribe from which Jeroboam came in opposition to Rehoboam, and Samaria was in Ephraim. The whole process of the division came because of that rivalry. Now, what I want you to see here is that by selecting Benjamin, a man from Benjamin, God was choosing the first king of Israel from the smallest and least significant tribe. Among people, if you read the book of Judges, who were constantly doing what they thought was right in their own eyes. The end of the book of Judges says that every man did what he thought was right in his own eyes. And if you go back and read Judges carefully, you'll find that Ephraim was mad at Judah because they weren't invited on a battle. Judah was mad at Ephraim because they weren't invited on a battle. There was this ongoing rivalry between these two power groups. And so you have a continuing situation of conflict between the sons of Leah and the sons of Rachel. Benjamin was obviously a son of Rachel, and being a son of Rachel, and being closest to Joseph, Benjamin had some influence with Ephraim. And in fact, if you look carefully at the story of Saul, you see that Saul had some pretty close connections with people in Ephraim. At the same time, being so insignificant, Saul was acceptable to Judah, which was the other major powerhouse. And if you want to check on the details for that, we'll see some of that next week. The scriptures identified that again in just some minor references, but the details stand out because they tell us the underlying political agendas that people are struggling with. As we look then at this situation, you have segmentary lineages. Basically, you have the tribe. Within the tribe, you have the clan. And within the clan, you have smaller groups of lineages. And those segmentary lineages fall into two broad major groups, those who are descended from Leah and those who are descended from Rachel. Now they change their alliances through time. And the conflicts are conflicts that were resolved in some situations and then broke out again in other situations. And the ultimate outcome was that when Rehoboam became so arrogant after he inherited the throne from Solomon that he was left with Judah and Benjamin, and all the rest of the tribes went with Ephraim. And the rest of Israel was on the other side. And so Rachel's children ultimately went with Leah's children in opposition to Judah because Rehoboam was so arrogant. That's much later in the story, so we don't need to talk about that. Basically, then, what I want to share with you is this, that God's choice was a compromise king. God's choice was someone who fit in the social structure in such a way that neither of the powerhouses, neither Ephraim nor Judah, could say the other is getting an advantage over us. The other side is going to be given privilege. The man that God chose was right for the political conflicts and the rivalries and the dissension that were part of Israel at that time. It's interesting that you look at the marriages, you'll find that the marriage ties between Saul and the other tribe was marriage to Ephraim. And Benjamin is a child of Joseph. And so the connection there was, again, a compromise connection. In other words, not a child of Joseph, a brother of Joseph. Benjamin was a brother of Joseph, a child of Rachel. And so the marriage is to Ephraim, and that came about in Judges chapter 21. You can look at how that happened. That then created a marriage tie to the rival side. Benjamin ordinarily would have good relationships with Judah because, I'm sorry, not with Judah, with Ephraim. They would have bad relationships with Judah. So in looking at how they dealt with Judah, Judah was the one that Saul had the most problem with. We'll see that as we get into the story next week. I realize I just said something a minute ago which is incorrect, so let me come back and straighten it out. I said that Benjamin and Ephraim were connected by kinship. Obviously they are, but the division, and they're not divided as they would be with Judah. Judah is really Leah's child, Benjamin and Ephraim are Rachel's child. So in looking at it, you keep that in mind. Now, my conclusion in this is that you must be aware of the kind of thing that happens in the social structure. And as I shared with you Larry Niemeyer's work in Africa, he realized that he had to be in tune with the social structure to have dynamic church ministry. In fact, his whole dissertation is on why people working in matrilineal social structures have not been effective in terms of establishing church ministries that grow and expand, because they're completely out of tune with the social structure. Okay, let's go on and take a look at a couple more questions here as we'll work through the remaining of the case study. The third point, what public and symbolic actions are required to legitimize the appointment of a leader? Roman numeral 3 in your outline. What are the public and symbolic actions required? These three questions, by the way, are crucial questions for you to analyze data. The first one, what are the qualities sought in a king? The second, what are the social structural regulations? This one, public and symbolic action, is something to understand. As you gather data, you want to be sure that you get this kind of data in your case so that you can reflect on it, analyze it, understand what it means. In this particular case study, there are a number of events which the text gives to us which are public and symbolic. Saul thought he was going up to the seer to find out where his donkeys were. But why he was really going to the seer was that God had planned this so that Samuel would begin the process of publicly anointing Saul, not publicly anointing him, publicly bringing him into the role of kingship. So the first thing he did was to take him to dinner. Now this was a symbolic act. Saul was invited to dinner, and when he was invited to dinner, how was he recognized? As distinguishable and different. Two things. No, not at dinner. He was taller. But what happened at dinner? A symbolic act. Moved him to the head. And gave him the choice piece of meat. Exactly. Those two issues were crucial. That he not only dined with Samuel, who was the seer, which in itself was a very significant invitation. In other words, to be invited by the prophet of Israel, the judge of all of Israel, to dinner is a very, very unusual event. Okay? That in itself was highly significant. But then to be placed at the head of the table and to be given a particular piece of meat, that was really the crucial agenda. And so you see those two details in the text. They are public and they're symbolic acts. Saul is being put forward at this point by the Lord as the Lord works through his servant Samuel. Okay, the second thing we see in this is the anointing following the dinner. And the anointing is private. And that's something that you find also is usually the case, that the anointing ceremony is not something done before a large number of people. It was done in this case in a private context. In the case of David, it was done in a family context, in the privacy of the family home. So this is a private act. It's not a public act. But it again is a symbolic act. It is the customary ritual. This is God's choice. And the anointing signified that something unusual is happening here. Then the text tells us that Samuel gave Saul some very specific instructions. He said 3 different things are going to happen to you. And he describes them. Rachel's tomb. He's going to meet 3 men with goats and loaves, and he's going to prophesy. Okay? So if you read on in the text, I'm not going to take time to read it, you find that exactly what Samuel prophesied happened. Now again, I think there's a very important lesson here. That when God calls leaders, God confirms his call by demonstrating in the next steps that the person takes his presence and the affirmation of that direction. He leads them into the place where they see his presence and they see his confirming work, indicating to them that this is indeed what God has chosen. This is what God has decided. As you, none of us are obviously have the prophetic voice that Samuel did in this context. And we may not be able to send leaders out that we have anointed and say, okay, when you get down the road, you're going to meet 3 men, and this is what they're going to say, and this is what they're going to do. You're going to come to Rachel's tomb, and this is what's going to happen. I haven't done that. But one of the things that I would say is this, that we should be counseling men and women that God calls to leadership in terms of the ways that God will confirm for them his call, in terms of the steps that they must take and God's confirming action in those steps. For example, if someone is called to the ministry, feels that call of God, and they know that the work of the ministry is to begin to study and prepare themselves, that's the first step they have to take. And what they should find in that is that they are personally fulfilled, that they receive joy in the study, and that they're successful in that study. And if they aren't finding joy in it, and if they're not successful, then they probably ought to ask the question, is this really what the Lord called me to do? Now, you might find you get C grades, but you have tremendous joy in getting them, in which case there's no problem with C grades. It doesn't say you have to have A grades. What I'm saying is that you have to find joy in the work that the Lord is calling to you and satisfaction that he's accomplishing what you want him to accomplish. So as you think about this public, the confirming signs are things that people need to find. As they take the steps, God will indicate that these are the right steps, that what you should expect will happen. You'll find joy in your ministry. You'll find the fruit of the Lord's calling evidenced. And Saul did that. He went and he met the 2 men near Rachel's tomb. He went from there and he met the 3 young goat, the men going up to Bethel with the goat, the loaves of bread, and the skin of wine. He went further and he prophesied. All those things that God had said he would do, he did. So as we think about this in terms of preparing people for ministry, we should help them understand that there will be confirming signs, that God will show evidence. John?
Who determines what those signs are, and whom must the signs convince?
The person himself or herself has to be convinced.
Okay.
The signs themselves are the signs that are most appropriate, and the Spirit leads them to understand that this is a test of faith. For example, when I was an undergraduate, I graduated from Wheaton. I was looking for the Lord's direction in terms of where I should go next. I felt sure that he wanted me to go in the Peace Corps. And so I signed up for the Peace Corps, and I was accepted. My wife was accepted. At the very last minute, we both were rejected for medical reasons. We saw those medical reasons as absolutely trivial. We said, how could this be? And so then we began to look, well, Lord, where do you want us to go next? What do you want us to do? And he said, take the next step. The next step was I'd been accepted to graduate school at the University of Pittsburgh. So I said, okay, I'll write back to Pitt. I'd already written to them and said, can I come 2 years later after I get out of the Peace Corps? They said, well, that's possible. You can do that. And so I called and said, can I come now? They said, sure. So we went to a wedding in New York. We came back. And I stopped along the highway going into Pittsburgh and got on a telephone. And I dialed 3 different schools. And I said, would you possibly have a job for an English teacher in your school for September? I was
in the Yellow Pages. I had no idea what was there. There were no ads. I'm just calling on the phone. The third school was a place called McKeesport. They said, yeah, we have a job. It opened up yesterday. I said, well, could my wife come over and interview for it? They said, sure, tomorrow. I said, well, how about today? Okay, fine. We went over there. My wife came out 10 minutes after we parked. And I said, what happened? And she said, I have the job. Now, I can tell you that was a confirming step. It was an incredibly confirming step because I felt the Lord wanted me to go to Pittsburgh. We needed to have support. She needed a job. And here we are coming along the road, and I get in the telephone booth, and who knows what school to call? Only the Holy Spirit knows. We found out that the day before, a woman had decided to retire who had not made a decision yet in the English department. That in that school, the year before, someone had started teaching there who had graduated from Wheaton College. And she was a great teacher, and so anybody that graduated from Wheaton had to be great. The third thing we found was that the principal of this school knew the principal of my wife's high school back in Philadelphia, and anybody came from that principal's school had to be great. So it only took 10 minutes for him to find these things out, and she was hired. Well, what can you say? It's the moving of the Lord. It's the leading of the Lord. Confirming signs are those kinds of things. I couldn't have prophesied that, and no one else would. But as I knew that the Lord wanted me to move in the next step, and I said, okay, I'll do it. Lord, you show me that this is the right way. He confirmed by his actions. And many, many other times in my life, I've seen the same kind of things. Each time it's different. In a little bit, it's a little bit like these things. You know, God working in a very specific way to demonstrate his presence and his power. You have another comment?
I was in a church conference once that was divided over leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Both sides felt that God's anointing was on their man and that God's signs were with their person. And it went on. I think there were 100 ballots cast in that conference. And in the end, it ended up in a standoff.
Okay.
So in a situation, and I'm sure that's probably happened before, or maybe in other situations, I don't know.
I would say in that situation with the standoff that neither man was appropriate for leadership in that context. That should have been a sign to them that there was something wrong in their ministry and in their work with the people. That there was significant conflict that could not be resolved because of where they were in that case. Now that may be superficial and I may need to know much more about it. But in a situation where the conflict cannot be resolved, there are obviously deep issues that have not been resolved. And people are trying to resolve those issues, and to get to it, we have to get much deeper in that process to understand it. Okay, the next thing we find here is public confirmation. The text, we haven't read this text, but in chapter 10, verse 8, Samuel tells Saul, you have to wait 7 days until I come, and then I'll tell you what to do. And then verses 17 to 24, it says, Samuel summoned the people of Israel to the Lord, said to them, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought up Israel out of Egypt. I delivered you from the power of Egypt and all the kingdoms that oppressed you. But you have now rejected your God, who saves you out of all your calamities and distresses. And you have said, no, set a king over us. So now present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and clans. Public assembly. Everybody is called together. When Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, the tribe of Benjamin was chosen by lots. Okay? Then he brought forward the tribe of Benjamin clan by clan, and Matri's clan was chosen. Finally, Saul, son of Kish, was chosen. Now, this may seem to you a little bit like a charade, because Saul had already been anointed before, remember? Here, this is a public event. The public event and the choosing of lots is to demonstrate to the people of God that this is, in fact, the one that God has chosen. Samuel already knew the results. Saul had already been anointed. So what this was a public confirming evidence of God's decision and God's choice in the life of this man.
Was it common knowledge that Samuel had already anointed Saul?
No, it was done secretly, remember? No one had seen it. The servant was even dismissed. It was only between Samuel and Saul. So there was no common knowledge. Only Samuel and Saul knew. But in this situation, I'm sure that Samuel didn't plan this so that it would come out this way, that he didn't use manipulation, that this was, again, part of the Lord using the lots to demonstrate to his people his choice and his decision in this process. So, it says, finally Saul, son of Kish, was chosen, but when they looked for him, he was not to be found. So they inquired further, has the man come here? And the Lord said, and here's the evidence that the Lord was in this, you see, yes, he has hidden himself among the baggage. They ran and brought him out, and as he stood among the people, he was a head taller than any of the others. Samuel said to all the people, do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among all the people. Then the people shouted, long live the king. Samuel explained to the people the regulations of the kingship. He wrote them down on a scroll and deposited it before the Lord. Notice the symbolic action, the writing. Then Samuel dismissed the people, each to his own home. Saul also went to his home in Gibeah, accompanied by valiant men whose hearts God had touched. But somehow troublemakers said, how can this fellow save us? They despised him and brought him no gifts, but Saul kept silent. Okay, as we look at this, we see there are sacrificial offerings and public feasting. This is something that they gathered together for this purpose. We see there are public lots. Finally, the public acclamation. This is the process which they went through to accomplish the anointing of Saul at this particular time. I think that every leader who is anointed needs public confirmation. That public confirmation is a part of God's plan in setting forth that person for the work that the Lord has for him to do. On November 25th, we're going to have an inauguration ceremony for Dr. Dennis Dirks, who will be the new dean of Talbot School of Theology. The inauguration will be a public confirmation of his leadership in the University of the School of Theology. We do it because this is appropriate, and this is what God intends that we should do as leaders are anointed and as they are brought forward to serve him in his particular way and for his particular purpose. Public confirmation is very important because it brings people together, it establishes a sense of unity, it establishes a sense of God's working among them, and it establishes a confirmation of God's work in the life of the person in terms of choosing that person to be a spiritual leader. My particular cultural and social background is one in which we kind of poo-poo public confirmations, and ritual is a waste of time. And we shouldn't bother ourselves with those kinds of things. But as I read the scriptures, I find that it's not a waste of time, that it's not something that's insignificant. It's something that, in fact, there is a purpose in, that the purpose is part of God's plan in bringing the people that he's chosen to lead into a place where they are going to be able to be effective and able to do it. Now, the last question, what assurances did Saul have of public acceptance, legitimacy, and support? It was mixed, a mixed bag. He had some people who were very strong in his support. It says valiant men supported him, but there were some troublemakers. Some people who raised questions and said, who is this guy anyway? He's just from this grimy little clan, grimy little lineage, a small tribe of Benjamin. He's a nobody. Just because he's big doesn't mean he's a leader. Why should we accept this guy as a leader? Now, that's going to happen every time you have a new leader appointed. I'm sure that there are a few people around that are saying that about Dennis Dirks, as he's been appointed to the position of dean in Talbot. That guy? Why would they pick him, There are always people who question God's choice. Always people who question God's choice. The leader then has to begin to lead to get support, and next week we'll take a look at what Saul did and how he responded to that. But there are always going to be troublemakers who despise. There are going to be people who reject. There are going to be people who question. That's part of what you have when you have the selection of a leader. The last question I have is, what are appropriate cultural and spiritual ways to install a national leader? Let's say that you're a missionary working in the Philippines, or you're a missionary working in Hong Kong, or you're a missionary working in Southern California, in the inner city. Okay? What do you do when you're working with people and you're ready to install a leader? What is the process? How should people be recognized? What are the kind of things that you need to go through? As you look at the case study that we've analyzed during this hour, you can see that we need to go into the community and begin to find out what are the qualities that people look for in a leader. If you don't ask those questions, if you don't begin to get an understanding of the qualities that people in that community see as part of leadership, you may choose the wrong people. You also want to find out the qualities of the people that you're thinking about. And you might want to ask the question, what was their father like? Because that may be a very important question in that community. You need to explore those issues in some depth. You also need to ask yourself the question, what are the social structural regulations? Who are the families? Are there rivalries between families? If we choose this person, will this mean that the other people will leave the church? What's going on in the social context? And how is that social context a part of the agenda for selecting a leader? Sometimes you won't have any problem at all, but other times it can be very complex. For example, you work gangs in Santa Ana, and a young person comes to know the Lord, have a ministry in the community. There are other gang members, and they happen to be from two different families and two different sides. You may have to have two churches instead of one for a while, because you can't bring the non-believers together. And the believers may be constrained by their family ties and their connections before they can do it. It may be something that requires a transforming grace of God before that act can actually happen. Same principle works in matrilineal societies. And you take an outsider male and bring him in, and he becomes a convert, but he has no influence among the other men and the other people in the community because he's an outsider. Those are issues you have to consider. Finally, you have to ask yourself, what are the public and symbolic actions required? How are leaders recognized? If, for example, a leader gains leadership in a gang by stealing or by killing, you can't do that as a Christian. What are you going to do as a functional equivalent? How are you going to help your leaders to establish themselves with honor and respect in a community? These are things that you need to explore. You need to think about. You need to find ways that a leader can be recognized according to the plan and the purpose that God has for them in a way that the community sees as legitimate and fits their particular needs and objectives. Okay? Thank you very much. We're on Lecture 10, page 30 in your syllabus, Leadership, the Study of Political Activity. The case study that we examined earlier this evening is the case study on political activity. And as I began the case study, I talked about the fact that we need to have tools to analyze case material. As we look at this lecture this evening, I'm going to be giving you more tools both for data gathering and data analysis. The purpose of this lecture is to help you begin to identify some of the key kinds of questions that you need to ask to gather data on leadership. In thinking about your field research projects, you're going to have to ask questions of the people that you're working with. You need to ask questions yourself. One thing I'd like to say in the very beginning in this is that the technical kinds of questions that I will give you in a lecture are not the questions that you ask when you're working with people in the field. Because I'm using an abbreviation. I'm using technical terminology to get something over to you quickly. You have to translate it. You have to interpret it. You have to get it into the life and the world of the people that you're working with. So if, for example, I say, who constitutes the whole, they're not going to understand that. They're not going to have an idea of what you're trying to get at. You're going to have to figure out how to translate that question into their language and into their understanding. So as I lecture tonight, I'm going to try to help you to understand key concepts and key questions. They will be of a theoretical nature. Your task will be to try to interpret those concepts and those questions, get them down into a practical nature, get them into a form that just anybody that you're working with can understand. If you are struggling with that, talk to other people in your team. That's why I put you together in teams, because I wanted you to work as teams to learn together of how best to do this. As I go through the lecture this evening, I will try to illustrate for you from time to time how I would translate this, how I would use it, how we would bring it into a practical setting so that you can use it for research. But if I did that with every question, we'd be lecturing for the rest of the semester on the questions. And so I'm going to trust you and your creativity to be able to take a conceptual frame and figure out how to get that into a practical domain to gather data. The conceptual frame will also help you then to analyze the data once you have gathered it so that you can interpret it and try to understand what its significance is. We'll start out with the concept of political activity, Roman numeral 1 in your outline. When we talk about political activity, we're talking about activity that focuses on the kinds of things that we discussed in Bowman and Deal. Resources, scarcity, conflict, competition, and conflict resolution. This political activity involves all of those kinds of things. As we try to define political activity in more concrete terms, there are 3 key things that I've identified here that I think will be helpful to you. The first thing about political activity is that it's public. That's different from private activity. It's different from family activity. If it's political activity, we're going to define it as occurring in a public domain. The article that you read for tonight by Schwartz, Turner, and Tuden identifies the public dimension as an important dimension of political activity. And they focus on that as a concept. They then talk about political activity as being goal-oriented. Okay, what do they mean by goal-oriented?
You have to have a public goal.
Okay, they have to have a public goal. What else?
A desired end.
A desired end. Okay, good, Jenny.
Consensus.
Okay, consensus.
Some degree on what their objective is.
Okay, some agreement upon what the objective is, so that it's a goal that people are working toward. There is an objective. There's some consensus about that objective. That's a key. Keeping in focus the goal orientation, and realize that there are some public activities that may not be goal-oriented. For example, you have the policeman pulling you over for speeding on the freeway. It's not really a public goal-oriented activity. The public does not have as a goal to see how many people we can pull off on the freeway for speeding. You know, we talk about that activity as an activity of social control. It's a basic way to keep people driving within what we have defined as an appropriate frame of action on the freeways. So a policeman pulling someone over is doing social control activity, not political activity. Political activity is what the President and Mr. Clinton are doing in terms of the campaign right now. They are working toward the objective of replacing the President or re-electing the President, whichever way you want to define it. Bush would say re-electing the President, Clinton would say replacing the President. So that's part of a public goal-oriented activity because the public wants to have a president who will provide leadership and solve the economic problems of the nation. So the focus there is on solving the economic problems. We're looking at 2 candidates, asking can they do the job for us, and we're engaging in a whole host of campaigning activities to try to give us the answer to that question, who will be the next president. In thinking about that then, goal orientation and public are the agendas that define political activity. The third thing that they talk about is a differential of power. What do you find as a differential of power? What does that mean to you? Political activity involves a difference in power.
During the process of this political activities, how does the power distributed or used or processed or
Okay,
operated?
how is power distributed? By the very nature of saying it's distributed, what does that mean?
Where is it focused?
Okay, where is it focused?
There are differences in the power that individuals or groups have.
Okay, Lisa, there are differences in the power that individuals and groups have. There are levels of power. Good comment. Okay, in thinking about levels of power, give me some illustrations of different levels of power. Think of the California state budget conflict that we've just gone through. What are illustrations of levels of power?
You have the governor,
Okay,
and you also have the 2 bodies.
Okay.
Assembly and the lobbyists.
Okay, you have the lobbyist. All right. What power do the lobbyists have?
To influence for votes.
Okay, to influence for votes. What power does the assembly have?
They present the budget. Well, they approve the budget presented by the governor.
Okay.
Approve or disapprove.
They also do what to it?
They change it.
They change it. Okay, they have the power to change it. They have the power to write in their own provisions. Okay, what power does the governor have? Okay, veto. Everybody thinks of veto right up front. And if the governor vetoes it, then what happens?
Goes back.
It has to go back. And the assembly has to work on it again. And then they resubmit it. So you see, the differential of power means that there are people who have more power than others. In our system, there are balances to power. The governor cannot decide the budget by himself. He does not have the power to do that. He can present a budget plan, but the assembly can take that plan and they can rewrite it. They can restructure it to do what they want. The governor, on the other hand, can say, no, what you've done to the budget is not acceptable to me, and then they have to go back and restructure it again. That's why we went through this long budget crisis here in California, because the assembly decided one thing, the governor said no, the assembly decided another thing, the governor said no, and so on, over a period of several months, actually. Sadia.
Yeah. So when a protest is being sent, is that to the governor office or to the assembly?
Protests can be sent both places, because both of them have power to do or not do what the people want. So some people are against the governor because he didn't go along with the assembly. Some people are against the assembly because they didn't go along with the governor. So protest in California was made at both levels.
But this elderly, that protest to the governor that I read in the paper. But why to the governor? Because the decisions already come to the assembly.
Okay, the governor probably vetoed, or the maybe the protest against the governor was because of the prior vetoes that the governor had done to the work of the assembly. So, because he did veto a number of things, or just said he wouldn't approve it, don't send it to me. The governor can tell them before they send it up, hey, if you do that, I'm going to veto it. And so at that point, they have to continue to work on it. Lisa?
So I just was thinking that one of the issues then is that you target your approach in terms of who you want to influence based on the type of power that they have, the type of influence. So if you want to make a change, then you would target the assembly. If you are disapproving of something potentially, then you might talk to the governor, or approving of something because he has that power to accept or reject.
Exactly. I've seen this past week, I got on my email in the office a request by someone on our staff to sign a petition to the governor to reject a particular bill that had been presented to him. So when people ask you to sign a petition to influence the governor, it's already at the governor's level. Whereas maybe back in March, they might have asked me to send a petition to an assembly man from my own district saying, don't pass that bill, write it a different way or do something like that because it's at that level. You direct your protest or you direct your influence at the level that has the power to do what you want it to do. This is crucial then to understand political activity. As we look at political activity, all three of these dimensions are part of it. We see that it's going to be public, it's going to have something to do with goals, and it's going to involve a differential of power. Now, if you think about a church has all three of these things involved in it. Every church has public, goal-oriented activity for which there is a differential of power. For example, in my church recently, we decided to start a Hispanic ministry. Okay? Now, to do that, we brought the issue to the people because it's a public issue. We couldn't do it without getting approval of the congregation. There were people in the congregation who objected to it. There were some who came to me personally, and why to me? Because I'm the moderator, and said, I'm really against this. I don't feel that this is going to work. I feel it's going to be a trap and it will cause conflict in the church. There were others who said, this is wonderful. We really ought to do this. And so we had a meeting. Now in the meeting there were discussion, some disagreements. people that were against it felt that they were outnumbered, so they didn't speak out very loudly. Well, ultimately, we made a decision. We voted. And in that process, the vote was overwhelmingly in favor of the ministry. Now, you had a public activity. We had a goal. It was to start a Hispanic ministry. Where's the differential of power? The differential of power comes in the difference between being a moderator or being on the Moderator's Advisory Council and being a member of the congregation. Being on the Moderator's Advisory Council, you're involved in the discussion of whether this ministry plan should happen and how it might take shape and what the constraints would be and how we work it. But if you're just a member of the congregation, you feel like those guys are planning this thing and I don't have my voice in it. If I were on that council, I'd speak again and I'd stop it before it got to the congregation. Some people feel like they don't have input in terms of the inner planning because they're not involved in that small group that brings the plan to the congregation. Now the congregation votes yes or no. The congregation approves or disapproves. But it's true. The people on the Moderator's Advisory Council do have access to the planning and the shaping of a plan before it actually comes to the congregation. So there is a differential of power. There's also a differential of power in terms of the financial support for the project. The staff and the Moderator's Advisory Council probably don't have enough finances themselves to support it. They're dependent upon the group as a whole to contribute to support that ministry. And so they recognize that unless we have a substantive majority of people supporting this thing, it's not worthwhile to have it go forward. So the actual finances necessary to make this happen have to come by the collective support of the whole. And if that isn't there, then no matter how nice of a plan it might be, those who shape the plan will drop it because there's no hope of it going forward. You need that support from the bottom to make it work. That's really what we're talking about when we talk about political activity. It's involved with resources, it's involved with decision making, it's involved with public support, it's involved with people expressing their ideas and discussing issues and making decisions. So as we look at this, there are a number of questions that you will need to ask. You'll need to explore who constitute the whole. Now, I told you I'd help you think about that. In other words, what makes up the public? Who is the public? The public for my church is quite different from the public for the budget of California or from the public for the presidential election of the United States. They're very, very different publics. And so if we're going to understand political activity, we have to begin to know how to define the public. What makes up the public? How is the public constituted? In terms of looking at the public, you wanted to try to describe it as well as you can. If you're thinking, for example, about the United States and the presidential election, you'd have to define the public in terms of all the people who are voted, registered voters. You'd have to define the public in terms of the parties that are involved, the Republicans and the Democrats. You'd have to define the public in terms of a third growing faction of people who are disenchanted with both the Republicans and the Democrats, the ones that the newspapers call the undecided. That's part of the public. So the definition of the public has to deal with those. You have to also think about the public in terms of the people who are dedicated core working members of the parties and those who are merely registered as voters in the parties, because there's a differential of power. If I am merely a registered Republican or a registered Democrat, I don't have much power in the party. The only power I exercise is at the ballot. But if I'm a member of the local Democratic Committee or the state Democratic Committee or the National Republican Committee, then I have much more power than if I am just a local voter. So the differential of power is seen in terms of the public and how it's particularly structured. There are sometimes factions and interest groups, and you need to understand how the public is structured, how it's shaped, what constitutes the public, how can you describe it. Second question you want to ask are, what are the public goals? The goals are sometimes very explicit, sometimes they're much harder to get at. You need to know what they are, because public activity is goal-oriented. You need to look at that. What are the special interests? How would we find that out? In the state, we just look at the lobbying groups. Who are the key lobbyists? That would tell us right away the special interest. In the church, what are the special interests in the church? Do you have lobbying groups in the church? Do you have people who have particular kinds of interest groups? What are your interests? I think that's an important thing to know. You're a participant. If you're in a particular group, what do you do? The third question we have is, who are the powerful? That's very important to understand. In any organization, who are the powerful? What is the source of their power? That's probably even more important. If you ask people at Biola who are the powerful, they'll tell you the president and the provost. If you ask us who are powerful, we'll tell you the faculty. Okay? Now, if you begin to ask the question, well, why do we have this difference in opinion? We can begin to explain the source of power. The source of power for the president and the provost comes in that we have the responsibility to administer the total budget of the university. The source of power for the faculty is that they control whatever they teach in the classroom. They make up their own course syllabus. They stand in the classroom, and nobody's there to check, right? Anybody around checking to see what I'm saying? I can tell you what I want. You might go and report to somebody that I've told you heresy in this place, but I have complete control over what happens in the classroom. The faculty have complete control over what goes on in the curriculum. They define the curriculum. They decide what you will have to do to graduate. The faculty has control over your grades. They decide whether you have been successful in going through that curriculum or not. They decide whether you have passed the examinations that are necessary. So the faculty have tremendous control over your education. Now, they can't control what they get for their salary. That's what I control. And I don't actually control that. Really, it's part of the total process of decision-making about salaries, but it looks like that the provost is the one who makes that decision, when in fact neither the provost nor the president do. It's a team-made decision, but those decisions are generally made at the top. In other words, we make a decision about how much money will be set aside for salaries in next year's budget. And we listen to people and get input, but ultimately if we decide that that's going to be 4.5%, that's what people get as salary increases. There's no more money than that to do it with. If we decide it's 6%, then that would be it. How do we make that decision? On the basis of what we expect the income will be, on what we expect the expenses will be, on what we see as a reasonable increase in the cost of tuition. We listen to people, we talk about it, then make those decisions. So yes, there is power in that area that's different from the power the faculty have. Both have significant kinds of power. The differential of power then is what you're looking at. What is the source? What is the power? And what is the basis for having it? Okay, let's go on. Political field. As we think about the study of political activity, Schwartz, Turner, and Tuden say it happens in a political field. Okay, what is a political field? As you read it and defined it, Bob?
Well, with the example you were just talking about, Biola would be your political field.
Okay.
At least for this is where you're operating at, where you're trying to get your goals accomplished and what group you're affecting. So that group then would make up the political field.
Okay, you're close, but not right. Okay, political community has some relevance, but the reason I say you're close but not right is I think that you have to understand the political field more broadly than just Biola. We're talking about Biola, but if you understand the concept of political field, how far does the political field of Biola extend? Just on this campus? Okay, the alumni is part of the field. Right. What else? Alumni we've got all over the world, right? Okay, where do the students come from? Okay, churches and constituencies. So the students come from the West Coast. We have 70% of our students come from the West Coast in the undergraduate program. Okay? In the graduate programs, they come from all over the world and from all over the country. So, you know, it's much more diverse at that level. Probably still we have more people coming from the West Coast and other places, primarily because it's more accessible to those people, or maybe they know about it better in this context. But still, that is much broader. Now, come back to you, Bob. What would we say that the campus is, if it's not the field? Go ahead, Lisa. The arena, that's right. The campus is the arena. Now, that's a very important distinction to make, because the arena is the place where the game is played. But the political field extends far beyond the arena. It's very crucial to understand that. I have gone through a tremendous anxiety in my experience here at Biola University because of things that are happening far beyond the arena, things that are out of my control. The president has suffered greatly from things that happen far beyond the arena. Last spring, for example, we had a faculty member who wrote a letter about the cancellation of Representative Dannemeyer's chapel. It was a letter written to the president. The president didn't get the letter because he was out of town, and the faculty member gave it to the chaplain. The chaplain had it on his desk, and a student working with the student chapel team picked it up and sent it off to somebody in Colorado. Now, the letter was very damaging in what it stated, and the person who got it in Colorado was a member of a Christian organization that has as its agenda a what you might call a radical right Christian political agenda. So this particular Christian leader decided that he was going to force the president of Biola University to make him have Representative Dannemeyer in California speak in chapel. And he was going to do this by letting everybody that he could in the United States know what was in this faculty member's letter. And so he has a newsletter. He had somebody else that has a newsletter. We received probably 40, 50 more letters back last spring about Biola going liberal, about Biola being soft on homosexuals, about Biola keeping Representative Dannemeyer from speaking here. The reason I share this story with you is because the political field of Biola is far beyond this arena. And the suffering that the president went through last spring in trying to defend Biola's good name to literally thousands of people that are part of the audiences here, that these men were trying to influence to reject Biola and not let people come here, was a tremendous drain on his time and on his energy. And he kept on trying to do this with the spirit of grace and a spirit of humility and showing Christ-likeness in his attitude and in his actions. I remember sometimes coming into his office and him struggling. He says, I want to be angry. I want to tell these men off. But he said, I know that I can't do that in the Lord, that I've got to respond with grace and with humility and with respect. Well, all of that is to say that so many things like that happen to us. Our political field, you see, is much, much broader than the arena. A few years ago, back in the mid-1980s, we had a pastor down in Los Angeles who picketed us at graduation. He was all upset about dancing on Biola's campus. Well, what it was a Christian concert in which some of our more enthusiastic, perhaps charismatic, who knows, students up in the front swaying with their bodies during some Christian music event. He took pictures, and some musician had smoke going up. He said, see the satanic influence here at Biola. All of this was his agenda. And, you know, he again tried to change us or ruin our reputation through this process. Well, that kind of thing happens all the time. It's part of the political field. It's this large extended community that we have that interacts with us and tries to influence us in terms of what we do. So the key thing about a political field is it has no boundary. Okay. It's forces that are at work. Now, if we were looking at Bob's company, where he works, we were to ask, what is the political field of this company? The customers are part of the political field. you see. They don't work in the company. They're not employees. They're not part of management. But they're a part of the political field, because if the customers say we don't want the product, then the company suffers. The competitors are part of the political field. Who out there is making a similar product? How are they competing with us? Are they trying to sell to our customers? Can we sell to their customers? That becomes a part of the political field. And so the political field can become, it can be fairly narrowly focused or it can be broadly focused. In this day and age, because of international communication, because of international trade, because of all of the kinds of things that happen in terms of transportation and communication, it's possible that the political field can extend to the world. And that we're influenced not merely by what happens in our local arena, but by things that are happening in many other places in the world. At my own local church, the political field is predominantly Southern California at the broadest. But we have missionaries in Japan, missionaries in Argentina, missionaries in Africa, missionaries in France. And so they're part of the extension of our ministry. We pray for them. We have an interest in them. They don't usually affect our local politics. But if something should happen that creates some kind of a theological discussion and dialogue within the larger fellowship of our churches, then our field extends much beyond California. And we then have dialogue going on with churches in other places in this country or in the world. So the field has this unbounded characteristic. Now, the arena. The arena is much easier to define because the arena has boundaries. At least it has a focal center. Has a place where things usually happen, and it has a normative structure. In other words, there are rules to the game. If you think about this, think about it as a football stadium or a soccer stadium. I remember when I was in Brazil a few years ago, I happened to be there during a time when there were some big soccer matches going on. And the game was televised. I happened to be in the city of Brasilia. The game was in Rio. And people in Brasilia were watching the game and rooting for particular teams. And one of my friends there was telling me a little bit about the Brazilian interest in soccer and the rivalries that were there and all of these kinds of things. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the soccer stadium is the central arena. The playing field is the place where the game happens. And so, you know, if you look at the stadium as the main arena, there is an actual sharper location where the game is really played out. And there are two teams that play on that field. There are other members of the team that are standing along the side to run in to replace a member that's on the field if a substitution is necessary. So this kind of thing is part of what we're talking about. We talk about an arena. It's a complex setting, and there can be people moving in and out of it. It has this kind of dynamic action. The political field of soccer extends as far as the television networks go, as far as the newspapers go, as far as the fans are interested in a particular team. It can be very broad or it could be very narrow, depending upon the popularity of the team and the kind of things that are involved in that. If you think about the soccer event that happens in the arena, you've got a structure which has its basic organization and rules. In our first 2 weeks, we talked about grid and group. Grid and group give you a basic theoretical framework with which to analyze the structure of the rule system, the rules of the game. You can ask whether there are a lot of distinctions in terms of roles and positions, whether highly sharply defined rules of what people should do, or whether they're relatively loose and undefined, whether there are not many rules that people negotiate as they go. You can ask whether belonging to a group is very important, or it doesn't matter which group you belong to. Grid and group provide a good diagnostic criteria for trying to understand the nature of the social structure in that kind of a setting. Now, in looking at the arena, you will also recognize that there are external influences. The external influences have to do with people outside who place demands on those people inside. With regard to soccer, the television network is an external influence. Probably the most pervasive influence in American football has been television during the last decade. It's the TV networks, the big money that they pay to show football games, and what that has meant in terms of profit for the owners that has had radical impact in terms of the whole game. How the game is played, the timing of the game, the rules are made primarily to fit within the needs of the television programming. All kinds of things have happened because of the networks. The other kind of external influence are the fans of soccer. I read a newspaper article just yesterday, I believe, that said that baseball was losing popularity in the United States in a very significant way. The fans are becoming disenchanted. They don't like the high salaries of the players. They're frustrated with the bickering with the owners. And there are many, many baseball stadiums that have very poor attendance. So the fans are a part of an external influence. Their support for that game or their support for the activity involved is crucial to understanding it. So every political arena has external influences, and you need to find out what they are. The activity gets down to what actually happens. What goes on in the arena? If it's soccer, you've got the teams. And as we look at activity, we've got four things here: the competitors and antagonists. Who are the players? How are they in competition with one another? Are they organized into teams? Are they organized into competitive interest groups? The Republican Party, the Democratic Party, they are the competitors. If we look at the second point, the demands, we see that the given situation varies in terms of the kind of demands that are made upon people. In a soccer game, the demand is to win the match. In a church, the demand may be for an expression of spirituality, an expression of growth. One of the things that we oftentimes hear in our church is, what direction is our church going in? We need to have a clear direction. And so people are demanding a direction. They want to see spiritual events. They want to see baptism. They want to see conversions. They want to see people's lives change. So the demands are part of what people expect in the situation in which they're working. There are also strategic maneuvers. Strategic maneuvers mean, how do people try to reach the goal? How do they try to fulfill the demands? For example, in a soccer game, you have the teams prepped to know how to play with specific strategies to try to get the ball through the goal. The football teams that we see on television, they've got complex offensive plans. They have to learn these plans, learn the variations, learn how to use this tremendous range of variation to try to get the ball across the goal. So there are strategic maneuvers, defensive and offensive, that are used by the teams to try to accomplish their objective. With the church, the same thing is true. Strategic maneuvers. We have Evangelism Explosion on Tuesday night. What's the maneuver for? It's to get people out involved in evangelism. We have Awana on Wednesday night. What's that for? It's a strategic maneuver to try to evangelize young people and teach them the Scriptures. We have basic Bible fellowships that are small groups of people that meet one night a week or one day a week somewhere, in which we try to bring believers and unbelievers together in a Bible fellowship where we celebrate our relationships in Christ. So each one of those is a strategic maneuver, an attempt to try to reach people for Christ, an attempt to disciple people to help them to grow in the Lord. So every activity has some kind of strategic maneuvering in it, some way to try to accomplish its objective. Finally, you have the decision outcomes. The decision outcomes have to do with who wins. You know, did the Buffalo Bills or the Dallas Cowboys win? Did the Rio Tigers or the Sao Paulo Knicks win? You know, I don't know what they are, but whatever it might be, wherever they are, there is this kind of competition. In our church relationships, did people come to know the Lord? Do we have good attendance in Awana this year? That's a big question. Do we have attendance? Do we see people doing what we expect them to do? These are the kind of decision outcomes that we talk about. Now, if you look at the organizations you want to study, these are some of the kind of things that you want to explore. You want to try to identify, these are concepts that basically give you direction. They point you to certain kinds of areas to gather data on. So as you begin your research project, you want to ask yourself these questions up at the top. Who constitute the whole? What are the public goals? Who are the powerful? Those are some of the things you want to find out. You want to find out what the arenas are. There might be more than one. In other words, things happen in different places, or there may be different things happening in the arena. You want to look at the external influences, the demand and support. You want to see the activities that people engage in and how they go about them. Now, as I suggested to you in the lecture earlier this evening, political events provide an excellent resource for you to gather data, to analyze data, to understand this whole issue of political activity and leadership. And I went through the case study of Saul and the selection of Saul as a leader. That's a political event. You can take the case study of how a business selected a leader or how a church organization selected a leader and go through the details of that, and that would be a good case study to work with. I just got finished with the process of selecting a new dean for Talbot. How did that happen? You could do a case study of that. You could go back and look at all the kinds of things that happened and a narrative of what happened from the time that Bing Hunter told me back in May the 29th that he was going to leave until I announced to the faculty on Monday morning of this week that Dr. Dennis Dirks would be the new dean of Talbot. What happened in that process? And I'm an informant. You asked me the question. Well, Sherwood, tell us about it. Give me the story. And I say, well, where do you want me to begin? Well, begin at the beginning. I said, well, let me see. Where is the beginning? Well, I guess the beginning is when Dr. Hunter resigned. Well, what happened? How did you respond? Then we start. Now, you have this crazy question about arena. And you want to try to figure out what arena I'm playing in and what are the external influences and how does this whole thing work. So you say to me, in terms of making this decision, how many people on campus did you have to consult with this thing? Did you consult with the faculty in intercultural studies or the faculty in Talbot or the faculty in arts and sciences? And I would say, well, no, I really only consulted with the faculty in Talbot. Okay, that tells you right away the arena is narrower than Biola University. Okay? So you say, well, why did you do that? I said, well, because really in the university, the schools are autonomous. The schools have the authority to make their decisions about their faculty and their deans. So that's why I did that. In fact, I consulted with the other deans, and they said, hey, we don't need to have our faculty interview him because really our faculty don't want them to come and interview us when we're being appointed. So there's a sense of division and autonomy. So right away I know the arena is smaller. It's Talbot. Okay, then you ask the question, okay, how did I then go about working in this arena? What were my strategic maneuvers? Now, if you ask me that, and I don't really know how to answer that, so you say, well, Sherwood, what procedures did you have to follow? What kind of things did you have to do? What were the kind of constraints that you struggled with? And I said, well, the first thing I did was I called the Academic Policies Committee and asked them to meet with me because this is ordinarily the committee that considers appointments in Talbot. Oh, okay. And tell me what happened there. And then I would go into that story. And said, then you can say, well, did you have to talk to the whole faculty? And I said, well, yeah, it was important to do that. I decided first, though, to meet with the faculty in small groups. And so I met with groups of 3 or 4 faculty over a period of several weeks to just interview them and hear how things happen. And then you could say, well, was that all? And I'd say, well, no, we actually had to do some more formal interview. Oh, formal interviewing. Okay, well, tell me about the formal interviewing. You keep probing. You keep trying to figure out what went on. Get the narrative to open up. You want the person to tell you the whole story. Now, they're not going to tell you the whole story the first time. So what you have to do is get the best part of the story that you can as you work with them, sit down and try to put it together, and then go back and you say, well, Sherwood, here's what I learned about you. I've tried to put this all together. Tell me if I've gotten the whole process. And you go back and you tell me back the story. Here's what you did. I say, oh, I forgot something. Okay? I forgot to tell you that in this process, I had an interview with the Council of Instructional Deans back in August, and they gave me some feedback about process. Oh, okay, then you add that into your thing. And then I had to have the candidate meet with the president, and oh, I forgot to tell you that I always talk to the president on everything I did. I let him know what was going on and asked for his advice. Oh, okay, now you begin to understand another external influence in the process. It just doesn't happen in the Talbot arena. And so on it goes. You explore these issues, you try to get the details, and you check back with the person and ask them to try and fill it in for you so that you have as complete a picture as possible. Now, after you have that picture, then you go through your data analysis. Now, I've tried to give you some questions that will allow you to get more detail and also to get the kind of detail that you can use to analyze and to go ahead and analyze it. So at the bottom of the page, you'll see in page 30, political events, we'll take a look at the issue of arena. If you want to understand this in more substantive detail, now you have to get into the grid and group stuff, how the arena works. What are the rules? When I say what are the rules, as I looked at this case study that I've described to you of appointing a new dean, what are the rules that I had to work by? Well, there is no rule book. There is no rule book. Okay? But one of the unwritten rules that I know you must follow is you must consult with all the people who are concerned, who have direct relationship to that person. It's unwritten. It's not written down anywhere. But I know that if I don't do it, you pay the price. How do I know that? Paid it before. I learned it through hard experience. So there's an unwritten rule. You have to consult with people. So what I have to do is work on that consulting process. There are also some rules of how the game is played in Talbot. And what I learned is that the Academic Policies Committee is a key leadership committee in Talbot. So I learned that, then I know I have to work with that group. They have to be given the respect due to them, or they're going to create problems for me. You know, they need to be consulted with. I need to give them the opportunity to give me direction, to give me their wisdom, to make a decision for themselves. And if they are not going to go along with what I think, then I need to change what I think. We go back and just talk about it again. So part of the rules of the game are that I have to consult with them. The standards of legitimacy. What makes this decision legitimate? If I violate this consulting process, the decision will not be legitimate. In thinking about this question, the goal of appointing a dean, one of the things that the faculty said to me was, we do not want a battlefield commissioning. Okay, now you have to know something about history, because Dr. Hunter was appointed as a battlefield commission. Okay? Now they loved Dr. Hunter. He was a great dean. He was a great dean. But at the time when he was appointed, there were a substantive number of the faculty who didn't want him, and after he was appointed, those faculty left. So it was a battlefield commissioning. The president made the appointment. So the faculty were almost unanimous in this. I didn't talk to every one of them, but they all said, we don't want a battlefield commissioning. Okay? They wanted to be consulted. So that was feedback that you got in terms of the standards of legitimacy. It would be illegitimate for me to make a decision without consulting them. They made it very clear right up front. That would not be legitimate. As you think about the arena, then, you have to know what the rules are, and you have to know what the standards of legitimacy are. What do people think is right? What can you do in a way that fits the rules? When you're working overseas, it's crucial to play by their rules of the game. If you play by your rules as a missionary, you're going to be making decisions that are illegitimate. In other words, you'll be operating in your arena, in their arena, with the rules from your arena, with the standards of what you want to do. It's critical to understand this. So many people make this mistake. They go over into another setting, and in that culture, they basically decide to play the game by their rules from home. And when they do it, it just doesn't work. It creates conflict. It creates hostility. We went through this in some of the case studies that we worked with earlier. You can't be effective if you play by your home rules. You've got to know their rules, their standards, the kind of things that fit within their arenas. Okay, looking further on in the case study, external influences, some more questions. Who are the external influences? What is the nature and strength of their influence? As I think about this from the case study that I've just described to you, the key external influences in making the decision were the president, the board, the other deans, and then a constituency out there, a constituency that's very loosely defined. One of the key questions we struggled with as we analyzed this decision was, what will the constituency think about somebody whose doctoral degree is in Christian education, being the dean of the seminary and the School of Theology? And we went around and around in that, discussing it in the Academic Policies Committee, discussing it in the faculty, discussing it with the candidate, and everybody expressed that concern, including Dr. Dirks himself. In other words, what is the constituency going to think of this? We finally decided it didn't matter, that this man was the best man for the job. But that external influence, that question, was one that we continually asked as we examined this situation. So, what is the nature and strength of influence? How do you have to deal with those issues? A question that we ask ourselves as workers in this is, what is our power and what is our influence? You as a missionary worker, working in a social situation, you have power and you have influence. How are you using it? Are you using it legitimately or illegitimately? One of the things that missionaries have and they don't recognize is tremendous financial power. They usually have access to resources that local people don't have. And while it doesn't look tremendous to you, to the eyes of the people that you're working with, this looks like, you know, a great unlimited bank back there that somehow keeps feeding you with money and keeps giving you just what you need, and somehow it looks like you have access to something that they know they don't have. Working on the Balut Island in the Philippines a couple of years ago, the indigenous people there kept coming to the missionary couple working with Wycliffe, and they would ask them for money. And in asking them for money, they were hopeful that they could give them what we would see as $3, $2, $1.50. In the Philippine currency, big money. In our currency, nothing. And to them, when they asked, this was like asking for, here, it would be like you came up and asked me for $100. You know, it would be a big sum of money to ask for 100 pesos, or 200 pesos, 150 pesos. You know, a large quantity of money for these people in terms of what they made. For us, it's nothing. And I watched the struggle that a missionary couple went about giving this 100 pesos, because they knew that there was a long line out there. And that those people thought that this could keep on coming. And probably at that level, it could come for quite a while. In other words, it's not a big drain on our economy, but it definitely would be a drain on their economy. A huge question of how you deal with that. What is your power and what is your influence? How are you going to use it? How should you use it in an effective way? Okay, there are a few more questions here that we need to look at. We talked about competitors earlier. Who are they? What are their goals? Will you take sides or will you be neutral? When you're working in political context, there are always people that are going to be taking sides. There are always competing interest groups. Where are you going to place yourself? Can you maintain neutrality? Is this something that you can sustain as you work with people? These are questions that are crucial to ask. I remember working on YAP and having the rivalries between 3 different sections of YAP. And I lived on one section. I had to live someplace. And so everybody in the rest of the island said, you belong to them. And I said, no, I don't belong to them. I just live there. I want to study people all over YAP. I want to know the politics in this place. It was very hard for me to build relationships in any one place without being then signed to those people. I developed some very close friendships on the southern end. And so then people said, oh, yeah, well, you belong to them and the people up in the north, but really, you still live over there. You really belong where you live. And there's a constant problem to try to negotiate my identity and who I belonged with and what was my legitimate place. So who are the competitors? What are their goals, and where are you going to be in this process? How can you maintain a neutrality? Can you? What is the place that you belong to? We've talked about demands. Again, this very simple question, what are the demands? What are the issues that people are concerned about? What are the implications of those demands? It's not a difficult question. Strategic maneuvers. This probably is one of the most important areas to work with. When you think about these questions, in relationship to strategic maneuver, you're trying to understand how people work to try to reach their goals. If you remember the church illustration I just cited for you, Awana, basic Bible fellowships, evangelism explosion, a variety of different strategies to reach their goals. Every organization tries to reach its goals in whatever they can see as the most effective strategies and the best options possible. They'll change them when things aren't working. They'll try to invent new ways of going about their objectives to accomplish what they want, so that strategic maneuvers are part of what it means to be involved in political activity. Now, from your point of view as a colleague and a co-worker in Christ, and as a missionary, you get involved in local politics, you have to ask yourself the question, do you want to be involved in their maneuver? One of the things I found is that oftentimes we find conflicts among missionaries because they don't want to be involved in national maneuvers. You can't stay out of it if you're going to be co-workers in Christ. You've got to deal with this question. You've got to struggle with the issue of how am I going to be a participant? What am I going to do here in terms of my relationships with people? I remember the case study that you read that you didn't intend to read in the back of the syllabus, the one on Cameroon. You had the SIL team working with the Bible Translation Committee. And the SIL team really wanted the Bible Translation Committee to take this program and run with it, to get the church support, to raise funding, to pay for their own translators and make it go. But they really couldn't do it without getting involved much more in the process. In other words, to become a part of the strategic maneuvers. They needed to partner in some activities, and to try to determine which activities they would partner in and which activities they would not was a big question that that particular team struggled with, to know exactly how to manage it and what to do with it. Sue Harris isn't here tonight, but she's got a great case study where she worked in Southeast Asia that focuses on how you can get involved in the strategic maneuvers. One of the best illustrations she tells is how she talked about checking the New Testament translation. And she talked with the key leader of her team and asked him if he would go out and check New Testament text. And he said, well, that didn't sound very interesting. And then as they were working on this text, after a while, I wish she was here, she could tell it, but as they were working on this text, he said, what does this checking really involve? She said, well, you go out and you read this to people, and then you ask them if they understand it. He said, you mean I could take this text and read it to old people and then ask them to understand it? She said, yeah. He said, hey, then I can have revival meetings with this thing. And so that's what he did. He went out to different places and he had a revival meeting, and what he'd do is he'd sit down with old people and he'd say, dear Father, he said, could we read this to you, and could you tell us if it's good Tagal language? And they said, well, yeah, we can do that. We know good Tagal language. And so she would read it to them, and they'd say, oh, that's pretty good. This isn't good. What does it mean? And then they would go into preaching, and the whole thing would result in a revival meeting. And many people were won to the Lord because of this involvement in that strategy. My point is that Sue had to connect with her team strategy. She had to get this in the process of what they wanted to do instead of doing it from her own framework and what she wanted to accomplish. The decision outcome, what happened? Checking was done, and there were revival meetings all across the whole area in which she worked. A tremendous outpouring of God's Spirit as she participated in this, getting her goals and theirs together and working on a strategy that was mutually beneficial. Okay, that's it.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.